Fire Emblem 7 Serra may be the first cleric that most Western players see in the entire franchise. Met early on in Lin mode, Serra is introduced as a happy-go-lucky cleric of the Elamine Church, who is being escorted to Ostia by her rather annoyed bodyguard Urk. Serra makes a big first impression with her loud, boisterous, over-the-top cheer that tends to be polarizing to both fans and other characters alike. Honestly, it's easy to disregard Serra as a one-note character. Fire Emblem certainly has no shortage of characters who are generally just presented as comic relief, and with her mostly comedic scenes, Serra initially appears to be among them. Many other characters write her off as a joke in both the story and her supports, frequently disregarding her, mocking her, trying to escape her. Suffice to say that a lot of characters don't like her very much. However, when analyzing all of her supports and taking a more holistic look at her character, some surprising depth is unveiled beneath it all. Under her bubbly exterior, Serra masks some deep trauma that puts her character into an entirely new context. Like many side characters in the series before her, Serra doesn't have the biggest role in the main plot of the game. After leaving at the end of Lin mode to continue her journey to Ostia, she quickly reappears in the main story, where the player gets a bit more information about her. She establishes herself as a noble of Etruria who is working as a healer for Hector and Ostia as a whole. Much like in Lin mode, she's presented as being quite confident in her abilities and her worth, though once again other characters might just disagree with that sentiment. In particular, there's Matthew, who, like Urk before him, finds himself as Serra's unwilling bodyguard and unable to handle her big personality. Much later in the story, Serra is given a few more optional conversations, where she can boast about saving her dear friend Lyn when the latter is in danger, and having a surprisingly heartfelt conversation with Hector following the death of his brother. However, like many other secondary characters, her role in the main plot doesn't really extend much beyond this. So instead, let's turn to her supports to really establish who Serra is. A number of her supports, namely those with Urk, Matthew, Sane, and Oswin, follow fairly similar beats. These supports are almost entirely presented as jokes. With Urk and Matthew, she largely just enjoys their company and has fun talking about trivial matters with them, a feeling that isn't really reciprocated. Sane, true to himself, flirts pretty excessively with Serra, which she initially finds flattering until she is eventually turned off by his lecherous nature. Meanwhile, Oswin wants Serra to work harder in battle, a notion that Serra quickly interprets as him hating her and wishing to torture her, before the two finally find some common ground. Meanwhile, with Florina, Serra tries to teach the shy Pegasus Knight how to be more confident, leading to the two becoming unlikely friends. A lot of characters tend to view Serra as, well, too much. Too much is a nice way to put it. Her energy tends to be interpreted by others as attention-seeking, if not outright annoying, and a lot of characters try to run from her or hide from her across their interactions. Urk and Matthew in particular began the game by loathing her. And honestly, these supports are really fun and entertaining on their own. While most of them appear to be simple comic relief supports without much depth to them, I must admit that, as a kid, I simply found these to be really funny, and Serra was already one of my favorite characters in the whole game. However, it wasn't until much later that I saw more of her supports, and that's when I finally got a bigger picture about her character, and the true depth surrounding her writing came into focus. Much like with her other supports, both her Hector and Lucius supports initially seem to be purely for comic relief. With Hector, she complains about not getting enough respect for her efforts as a healer, while he comments that she would be easy to replace. In the Lucius support, she initially mistakes him for a woman before becoming jealous of his radiant beauty. Certainly, these supports are initially quite funny, very much in line with the rest of her conversations, but both of them take a turn that puts her entire character into a totally new context. You see, a surprising detail comes to light in her support with Lucius. As Serra speculates that he must be nobility with how he looks, Lucius quickly corrects her and tells her that he is in fact a commoner, and one who grew up in an orphanage following the deaths of his parents at that. The tone of the conversation quickly shifts as Serra explains that her own circumstances are not so different, since she was raised in an abbey, indicating that her childhood was not as happy and carefree as one might expect. This detail is expanded upon in her supports with Hector. Her past comes up once again in this conversation, and shortly after, Hector mentions that he has personally seen the last remaining abbey in Ostia, and he knows that the conditions in it were terrible. Serra reluctantly acknowledges that, indeed, she grew up with little food or warmth in a place that she describes as sad and lonely. Still, she insists that her parents must have been nobility who left her there for her own good. While Hector politely agrees with this notion to help reassure her, it seems rather likely that Serra's true parents were either killed or were even commoners who simply abandoned her as a child and never truly cared for her. Though Serra denies this harsh reality and maintains her stance, it's clearly a deep vulnerability for her. Suddenly, her character is cast in an entirely new light, and her other supports become more interesting to re-examine by proxy. Everything in Serra's earlier supports, namely her loud nature and desire for the attention of others, becomes less of a gag and more of a telling feature of her character as the player is made aware of her past. In fact, much of her behavior can be examined through the lens of her simply being lonely, owing to her never having a family. There's actually a pretty common thread through most of Serra's dialogue throughout the game. From her introduction to many of her supports, she commonly just wants to be around other people, even if they find her annoying and try to flee from her. Being alone seems to be one of Serra's greatest fears. This view is reinforced by an exchange late in her Urk support. When Urk tells her that he has to stick with her because no one else would care if she went missing, she clearly takes the remark deeply personally, and she's visibly upset by it. The notion of that sheer rejection, of being shunned and alone, hits right on her greatest vulnerability. Being alone and rejected by others clearly hurts her, which leads into her greatest wish: genuine relationships with people who care about her. From wanting Urk to stay with her when he threatens to leave upon the duo's introduction early in the game, to seeking praise from Hector or proudly declaring that Lynn is one of her dearest friends, Serra just wants people to like her. In fact, while she may come across as superficial, her Sane support shows that she's anything but. Sane is one of the few characters to initially praise her, something that she claims that she loves. Yet after seeing him flirt with everyone, she's the one to reject him in the end, a notable reversal over the dynamics in most of her other supports. If she truly just wanted attention and praise, it would be easy to allow Sane to continue to adore her as he does with so many others, but it's her desire for that genuine connection that prompts her to turn him down. Even if she may annoy others, I feel that she truly wants people to care for her, something that she never had as a child. I don't see Serra as a character who seeks attention just for the sake of attention, as one might expect from just a surface-level look at her dialogue. No, I see her as a sad and lonely child who fears rejection and just wants to be loved. However, there is a notable upside to all of this, be it in the supports themselves or her character endings. Almost invariably, Serra manages to win people over. In fact, almost every support that Serra has ends on a sweet note, despite how rocky some of them are at the beginning. She finds genuine friendships with Florina and Lucius. Hector tells her that she can consider herself part of his family, and she can have paired endings and enter relationships with Urk, Matthew, and Oswin, even easing their own burdens with her presence. No matter how off-putting Serra might be to other characters at the start, she always manages to find people who love her in the end, winning them over despite her flaws. Serra's past opens another angle on her character entirely beyond just her loneliness and desire for relationships. I would posit that Serra's very personality actually stems from a rejection of the cold truth of her past. While this is admittedly just my own interpretation, without as much direct evidence in the text, I feel as though her boisterous personality is something of a front, a mask for her insecurities. You see, in both supports where she directly deals with her past, her personality shifts entirely. Her A supports with both Lucius and Hector lead to her breaking down as her past is exposed and she's forced to face the harsh truth. She breaks down into tears and insists that she must truly be nobility despite lacking any evidence, even shouting at Hector when saying that she knows that she has to be nobility. It seems less like she's trying to convince Hector about her story, and more that she's trying to convince herself, trying so desperately to keep the mask up to shield herself from facing the truth. In fact, this view is reinforced by a very specific line in her Hector support, when Serra directly states that she was able to cope with the terrible conditions in the Abbey because she knew that it would get better. The idea that her noble parents would come to rescue her from the cold nights and the loneliness allowed her to keep going in spite of it all. In these moments, it seems rather apparent that her circumstances weigh heavily upon her, and that she simply cannot accept them. It's a deep vulnerability for her character, and shows that beneath her bubbly surface, she's actually quite fragile and traumatized by her youth in the Abbey. Serra's rejection of her fundamental reality additionally supports the idea that much of her personality is a facade. By pretending to be a noble and acting like the spoiled child that she wishes she could have been, she averts her eyes from a miserable past and the probable truth that her parents simply abandoned her after all. She has essentially constructed a character for herself, the rich princess that's so far from who she really is, one that can be bubbly and happy at her own whims without a care in the world. Though she wishes that she could have vassals who served her, that she could be a beloved fashionista, and that she could be a rich and noble princess, all statements that she makes in various supports, the truth of the situation is that these things are totally out of her reach. As much as she would love for this story that she's constructed for herself to be true, for her allegedly noble parents to swoop in and rescue her from the pain that she has endured, it seems exceptionally likely that this will never happen. It's simply a coping mechanism, some small ray of hope in the gloom of her life. Even her confidence, which initially seems so boundless, comes into question in her support with Florina. When Serra notes that Florina lacks confidence, she tells her to puff out her chest and pretend that she is better than everyone in order to feel more confident, something that she attributes to her status as a noble. But we know that she very likely isn't a noble herself. A parallel is immediately drawn between the two characters, as we can see that Serra is essentially doing what she's telling Florina to do. Serra is metaphorically puffing her chest out, exaggerating her confidence to mask her own insecurities. That's not to say that I think that Serra's entire personality is fake by any means. I merely think that it's an exaggeration, a subconscious escape from her brutal reality that offers her some small solace and hope for a better future. She plays into the spoiled princess character, and in that manner she's able to keep herself going, to find her own confidence, to be the person that she wants to be by maintaining the story. This, to me, is the emotional core of Serra's character. She's presented as a bubbly, fun-loving, childish, and carefree girl. Yet, all of that stems from a single lie that she has convinced herself of. The lie that the world could not be so cruel to her, that she must be nobility, that her parents couldn't have done something so heartless as simply abandoning her. That rejection of her fundamental reality and the subsequent facade of nobility leads to the Serra that we meet in the story. It's her own way of smiling through the pain and managing to cope with a cold world around her. Because at the end of the day, Serra just wants to find acceptance. Be it with Urk, Matthew, Oswin, Hector, Lucius, or Florina, she so frequently just wants validation in her supports, to find people who genuinely care for her. In this manner, certainly her behavior could be seen as attention-seeking. But rather than the negative connotation of the term, I see Serra as craving the love that she never got as a child, and just wanting to not be alone anymore. From the start, Serra feels like a gag character, purely designed for comic relief. She comes across as overly energetic, oblivious, and perhaps even annoying to some. Many characters can barely tolerate her presence and make a point to try to flee from her, and her complaints are presented as superficial and silly. And sure, that's a major component to her character. A lot of her dialogue in the entire game is simply played as a joke. But in the end, certain supports reveal the underlying insecurities that she holds as a result of being abandoned as a child. Serra seeks validation and acceptance, rejecting the harsh reality of her life and asserting her own wishes, constructing a facade for herself to endure her crushing loneliness. She wants to be the spoiled noble princess that she pretends to be so badly. But more than anything, Serra wants to be loved. She wants the attention that she never had as a child, and she acts out to get it, even if it's much to the chagrin of everyone around her. So while Serra is already a character that I find fun on the surface level, owing to her funny dynamics with the rest of the cast, it's that emotional throughline to her character that makes her truly shine for me. Serra isn't just a joke, but rather a character with legitimate depth owing to tragic circumstances. It's that touch of sincerity that elevates her from fun comic relief to a truly great character.